In this super simple video, I'm going to tell you guys whether or not you should shoot in 24 frames, 60 frames, 120 frames, or even 240 frames per second in this video. Stay tuned. How's it going, guys? My name's Peter, and you're watching a Broke Visionary Collective, where I help people make better video content, especially if you have a low budget camera or any camera gear, especially if you have a Nikon. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet, and give me that like for that algorithm. So in this super kind of one-take video I'm going to talk about when you should use slow motion and when should you consider, should I be shooting in 24 frames or 60 frames per second? So the basics concept of video or cinematic movies is that most things are filmed in a 24 per second, frames per second timeline. This video is filmed in 24 frames per second with a 1/50 of a shutter speed. And as you can see, there's a little bit of motion blur, and filming in 24 frames per second, 1080p, or that's 4K, it is the most natural to the human eye, and you can see motion blur, right? It's most equivalent to it. So for example, if I shoot this in 60 frames per second, it's gonna look really choppy. And if I crank the shutter speed up, because if you shoot in 60 frames per second, your shutter speed needs to be double that, so then it's 1/120, and it's gonna look super choppy unless you conform it to a 24 frame timeline sequence. Then you'll get smooth slow motion, right? But I get into that and tell you the details and the exact settings of why or how you shoot slow motion DSLR videos. It doesn't matter what video camera you use, whether it's a Nikon, a Canon, a Sony. Link in the description as well as below for that video on shooting how you shoot slow motion DSLR on any video. But there's, for this super simple theoretical based things that you should know is I personally shoot slow motion or 24 frames per second is for any dialogue, right? Like this right now is, there's no movement, and normal shots where you don't need to have any cinematic kind of look or feel, and especially when there's a talking head, you always want to shoot that in 24 frames per second, having 1/50th of a shutter speed. And the second thought is that you only want to shoot anything above 24 frames per second. In my experience, for my own professional clients and my own portfolio, you want to check that out, is for B-roll as well as having any sort of additional footage or emphasis. So B-roll / cinematics, right? So you want to shoot slow motion the faster the subject is. So for example, if you're filming sports, like I'm Canadian, so hockey, right? Imagine someone, or baseball, or they're doing come and swing, or they're shooting a puck, is that motion is really fast. So how you capture that is you want to film in slow motion. So I would recommend, if it's someone just walking and you want to make it look a little bit more cinematic, film that in 60 frames per second. If it's something a little bit more fast, like a sprinter, or you're shooting some kind of commercial for some kind of product like a shoe or a jacket, you want to make it look more cinematic, you can film anywhere from 60 to 120 frames per second. I like to differentiate. Sometimes when I shoot things like model videos is that I can shoot it in 60 frames, but if you want to look more for like a fashion, a lookbook, I personally prefer shooting at 120 frames per second. But the good school of thought to have when you're shooting with slow motion is that the faster the motion, the faster the frame rate that you want to film at, so you can capture every single movement. And you also want to be aware that when you film in faster frame rates, you're not necessarily filming for audio. Hence, it goes back to the first school of thought, is that when you're actually filming 24 frames per second, you're capturing talking head videos, you're capturing essentially dialogue video as is, and you're not adding any emphasis. Because if I filmed in, I'll show you guys a split comparison. If I put a 60 or 120 frames per second, right, timeline, and my shutter is 1 over 250 and I put that in a 24 frame per second sequence, it's gonna look really choppy and just really unrealistic. And I can also show you right now, I'm gonna change my settings in the next clip, in the next cut, and I'm gonna film that in 60 frames per second. And I'm just gonna keep the settings as is, and you're gonna see the difference that it makes. So right now, I am filming at 1 over 60th at 60 frames per second. As you can see, doesn't this look so weird? This is why you should never film talking head videos at 60 frames per second, because it is really weird. And if you want to get the proper smoother frame rates, you should shooting your shutter speed at 1 over 125. So this is proper slow motion footage, but I'm putting this in a 24 frame per second timeline, so it's gonna look very choppy and weird. I'm gonna put it side by side so y'all can see the difference. And yeah, for talking head videos, 24, just remember that anything above 24, like you want to shoot at 30 frames for handheld little steady cam handheld gimbal action by yourself, 30 frames, 60 frames, think of it like you are someone's walking or running, or you want to do like a pan up or pan down, 60 frames. Anything more cinematic or a model or some kind of high speed action, 120 frames per second. Anything above, you're looking at something like the slow-mo guys, right? Where they're doing something where the human eye cannot see. You want to film that at a very high shutter speed, but also know that most cameras, the higher the shutters, the higher the frame rate you shoot at, just know that the quality is going to be reduced because of the processing power that's required for these videos. So yeah, I just want to talk to you guys just about when should you consider shooting slow motions, 24 frames per second, 60 frames per second, anything above. Usually anything above 120 frames, you want to think about something cool, like you have a little water balloon and you pop it, 240 frames, that will look pretty cool, right? So the faster the motion is, just like having think of it like you're taking a photo, right? You want to take a photo of a bird that's flying in the air and it's swooping down, right? You want to crank your shutter speed all the way up. Think about that in frame rate, right? Same with video cameras. If you want to film something that's moving super quick and you want to capture it for more of a cinematic sequence, you want to film at a higher frame rate. The more higher, the more likely you're about to get every frame that talent or subject or product is moving at. In comparison, if it's someone that is just walking slowly, you don't want to film them at 240 frames per second. So that was just my little spiel on whether or not you should film slow motion, when should you have it as normal 24 frames per second, and that is my overall thoughts from a videographer and video editor experience when I film my own videos for my own clients. And if you want to actually learn how to get the proper settings, and I go step by step on this camera, link is in the description for that video itself. It's how to shoot slow motion on any DSLR, not just the Nikon, as well as check out if you want to help you, is that I do have a resource on how you learn Adobe Premiere and how you can edit just like me from a complete beginner to an expert. Links in the description, as well as if you want to check out my free camera guide, get that as well. It will help you with all your basic gear when you first start off on YouTube. My name is Peter. You're watching Broke Visionary Collective, where we all start with nothing, but you can always create something. Cheers.